Ja, that ist me und mein beautiful 262 in the spring of 1945. Und that behind me, that is a 2,000 kilogram bomb, tiny little wings, tow bar and some skateboard wheels. You're probably wondering how I got here, yeah? Well, it's quite the story and we will need to go back to the beginning. Sorry, can we drop the accent now? Hello. My name is Lord Hardthrasher, winner of most creative use of a second-hand adult toy, the 1999 Hellfire Club Annual Supper, and sometime commentator on history on YouTube. Today we're going to spend some quality time looking at the development of the Me262, which was certainly one of the jets of World War II. The problem with looking at something like this is that basically every single source you look at is either a lying Nazi or an apologist for a lying Nazi, and you can't trust anything that any of them say. Also, every hack historian commentator on the internet have become completely obsessed by the supposedly advanced technologies that the Allies found in the wreckage of the Nazi state. The 262 is touted variously as the first jet in the world, which it wasn't, the first fighter jet in the world, which it wasn't, the first operational fighter jet in the world, which it wasn't, and a weapon which could have turned the tide of the war, which it couldn't and didn't. Because Germany lost, because the Nazis committed atrocities on an industrial scale, because millions died opposing Hitler's war of conquest, because no one quite wanted to admit that they supported the war or, God forbid, enjoyed it, literally every single record you touch is tainted in some way, being written or said by someone with an agenda a mile long, many of whom are lying about what they did and why they did it. A bit like a couple who've rented a lonely cabin in the woods, today you and I are going to descend into the basement of World War II lore and look at the native burial ground that lies therein. We are not going to do speeds and feeds, nor the 100 most dangerous missions of the war. We are, however, going to look at the politics and the development of the Me262, look at it whether it was actually much cop as a jet, and what impact it actually had. By the late summer of 1943, Willy Messerschmitt was having what might reasonably be called a bit of a bad day in the office, kicked off the board of his company, staring down the arse end of a $900 million settlement bill, and on the cusp of accidentally making his entire product range obsolete. And it had all been going so well up to this point. In the mid-1930s, Willy had been behind both the Bf-109 and then the Bf-110, the two most iconic fighters of pre-war Germany. The problem was that by 1943, both of them were complete shite compared to pretty much every single Allied machine in the sky. In fact, the 110 had been shite when the war started in 1939, so Willy had been working very hard to create its successor, the Me210. Believing his own hype, he'd converted his entire factory to making the 210 before it even flew for the first time. So when it turned out to be absolutely the worst aircraft of World War II by almost every measure, he was as fucked as a sock in a teenager's bedroom. After killing off 5 test pilots in quick succession, the Luftwaffe, and Erhard Milch specifically, took great pleasure in cancelling the project and demanding the astronomical sum of 40 million Reichsmarks in compensation. Although a huge sum, had that been the only issue, it might have been manageable, but it was far from the only issue. Messerschmitt's wartime record was abysmal. In 1940, following the horrific losses in the Battle of Britain, Messerschmitt AG had tried to adapt their pre-war Me209 racer into a successor for the Bf-109, and failed. In 1941, he got an order for a theoretical bomber, the Me264 long-range America bomber, and then that program had promptly folded. In 1942, they tried to get the Me309 to work, and that failed. At the end of 1942, Willy had then gone for the new high-speed bomber contract, and taking a leaf out of Heinkel's magic mushroom-inspired design for the twin HE-111Z, he'd submitted the Bf-109 ZW, presumably thinking that because it was two Bf-109s strapped together, no one would notice that it was, well, two 109s strapped together. Sadly for him, their powers of perception saw through this cunning ruse, and they awarded the contract to Dornier. In a bit of a panic at this point and facing bankruptcy of his beloved company, Willy managed to change the 210 into the 410, which sort of worked for a bit, but by late 1943 it was already looking rather outdated. And then again in 1942, Willy had tried to cover off this string of unfolding disasters by revamping the 209 into the imaginatively titled 209-2, which the Luftwaffe had ordered, cancelled, cancelled again, and in late 1943 was trying to cancel for a third time. A few facts were beginning to slowly dawn on Willy, and indeed a great deal of the people that work for him. Firstly, Germany was Germany was going to lose the war. Secondly, the Me262 jet plane that he'd been building for the last 3 years, basically on a shoestring, made everything else that he'd manufactured obsolete. Third, the margins on the 109s that he was still churning out at quite the rate, he'd make 34,000 of them before the war was over, were quite nice, and he didn't really want to lose that cash flow. On the plus side, however, the Luftwaffe High Command and the RLM, that's the Reich Air Ministry, were beginning to absolutely shit themselves and were demanding new ideas from organisations just like Willy's. This might just give Willy the room to pull off a little bit of a blinder. Get it right, he could save his company, keep making 109s and curry favour with the Führer. All he needed to do was to get the 262 into the fucking air. Back in the day, before Hitler had decided to test the old adage everything is a sex toy if you invade it hard enough, there was a slightly dim, rather nice chap called Ernst Udet. Ernst was, sadly for him, but rather brilliantly for the Allies, wildly bad as the Chief of Procurement and Supply for the Luftwaffe, and before that he'd been wildly bad as Chief of Technical Staff to the Luftwaffe. So from 1936 to September 1942, really anyone with a creative mind, a plane that could potentially dive bomb, a willingness to bribe Udet with drugs and alcohol and pretty girls, could get funding for pretty much any new design that they had on the drawing board. And Göring had tried to stop all of this madness in 1940, getting everyone to focus only on projects that would come to fruition by the middle of 1941, but this was Nazi Germany. A bribe here, an accusation of Jewry there, a case of homosexuality over there, and before you know it, there's a new order, a few million Reichsmarks, and Udet's signature. Particularly pre-war, this had led to all manners of absolutely batshit crazy ideas emerging from the German design bureaus, most noticeably for our narrative, jets and rockets, but few of these ideas had actually turned into anything that, flew or was usable in any way. 1943, from the Nazi point of view, was a total fucking car crash. Between January and May of that year, more than 500,000 of their troops had surrendered to various enemy forces. Luftwaffe losses over the Reich and elsewhere were beginning to become unsustainable. The RAF was burning down cities almost at will, and as an encore, sank 60% of their U-boat fleet in just 2 weeks in May. The US daylight bombing effort wasn't doing a lot of actual damage, but it was there, and it was getting stronger, and it was becoming more serious by the day, if you'll excuse the pun. Suddenly, the aircraft industry was the centre of Hitler's attention. Up until his cities began to disappear into fire and ash, Hitler had spent most of his time farting about on tanks, approving things like this, and whatever one of those is. Look, the massive metal boxes with a gun on the front of them. I don't see what the attraction is here, but whatever. Hitler fucking loved him, one of those giant metal boxes with a big gun on the front, and he spent many a happy hour making them bigger and heavier and more complex and more expensive and more difficult to make, and progressively less and less useful as he went. But in 1943, that changed, and suddenly his focus was on aircraft. And Willy knew this. Just like everyone else, he was working towards the Führer, so he did the sensible thing. He got his pictures of his jet plane, he got some of the prototypes together, and he started to present them to Hitler on a more regular basis. But what Willy and basically every other sane person in Germany hadn't quite clocked was just how childish and stupid Hitler was going to be about this. Fighters are for defence and bombers are, at least in theory, about offence. Therefore, Hitler, having a toddler's view of the world where bigger is always better, the Führer was completely disinterested in protecting his civilians and even his industries, and fixated far more on smashing the enemy with bombers, a fact we will come back to in a minute. Initially codenamed the P1065 or P65, what would become the Me262 project had begun under Udet's wacky racist regime pre-war, to try and see if jet propulsion could really be used for serious applications, firstly as a fighter, then a fighter interceptor, and then as a fighter bomber. Jet aircraft design at this point was, as you might imagine, somewhat rudimentary, and even basic stuff was a real challenge. Initially, Messerschmitt was actually going to wind up using BMW's engines, that's the P3302 and the P3304 for those nerds that are out there, but there was a slight hitch with this plan. When BMW said new, what they actually meant was entirely theoretical, and every time anyone asked them how big, or how heavy, or how much power these things would have, the engineers at BMW sort of mumbled incoherently and shuffled their feet. The weight, in particular, kept climbing, and this left the lads at Messerschmitt with a bit of an issue. They'd actually planned originally to try and enclose the engines in a pretty standard pair of wing nacelles on a straight wing, but the weight uncertainty meant sweeping the wings slightly for extra strength and dropping the engines underneath them a bit like bombs on a pylon. Thus the revolutionary swept wing, which every bloody video on Earth seems to bang on about, was there not so much to make it go faster, but because it was a design cock-up as a result of BMW's failure to provide engines. This then presented a bit of a further problem. The new underwing engines would throw exhaust gases back over the delicate little tailwheel and potentially melt it, and also, if the plane was on an angle, it might bang those rather sensitive new jet engines on the ground, and banging experimental jet engines on tarmac at a few 100 kilometres an hour seemed like a bad idea, which meant a whole new undercarriage system had to be designed. So in December of 1940, Messerschmitt redesigned the body to accommodate this new system and turned it into a tricycle setup. Because the jet was expected to be pretty fuel hungry and because of the new undercarriage setup, there wasn't a lot of room left in the wings for fuel tanks. Now obviously the correct response to this is to simply weld two giant fuel tanks on top of the wings as God and King intended, but for some weird reason no one ever does this except us Brits. So in fact what the Germans did is they filled the wing space as best they could with the fuel that they could get in there and put the rest of it around the pilot. And then instead of putting guns in the wings, they shoved 4 30mm cannon into the nose. The problem was that by 1941 all this redesign work had massively slowed the project down, which didn't actually have a lot of people working on it in the first place. The Air Ministry, the RLM, had initially been jolly excited about jet programs generally, and the Me262 was one of them, and in mid-1940 it had ordered 20 prototype jets from Messerschmitt and 20 from Heinkel. But by January of 1941, neither company had been able to deliver a single one of those jets, and by the spring the RLM was beginning to lose interest, focusing instead on the Bf-109F and the Me209 successor programs. Now, for all his flaws, Willy knew how to work the Nazi system. He knew that he needed to showcase something flying as soon as possible. The problem was that BMW couldn't get their engine to work, so instead the lads at Messerschmitt had a rummage around, looked in the spares bin and came up with an ex-Spanish Civil War Jumo 210 piston engine, which they stuck into the nose as a kind of starter for 10. And sadly for the posterity, the pair of 750-kilogram rockets that they proposed to simply fling under the wings to see how fast it would go weren't available. Nonetheless, the test mule flew in April of 1941, and flew pretty well, and it was good enough to try and get a few quid back from RLM to keep the project alive. But there things kind of stopped, because for the next few months, Willy was distracted by a cuckoo in his nest.
Jenkins, grab some popcorn. The Nazis are going to start fighting again.
On the 13th of August 1941, the Me163 V4 rocket-powered fighter made its first successful flight using an HWK RI-203 rocket engine. Now this should have been a joyous and order-filled occasion for Willy, but there was a slight problem. All that spring and early summer, as the 262 engines failed to turn up, the 209 project was canned and the 210 project was imploding, the Nazi High Command was circling around Willy's Willy with a cigar cutter in hand. Meanwhile, the Me163 had been performing impressive-looking glide tests over the factories at Regensburg. And this had been galling enough, but then came the transfer to Peenemünden, the addition of a proper rocket engine and the first test flights, and things went maximum Nazi really quick. The problem was the Me163 project was actually nothing to do with Willy at all. It was a carbuncle that had been foisted onto Messerschmitt by Udet and the RLM as a price for doing business. Effectively, it was an incubator. It got cash and facilities and a line of credit, and Willy got, well, fuck all back really. The designer and the project director was a guy called Alexander Lippisch, who loathed Messerschmitt, and the feeling was entirely mutual. Now that the 163 could fly and the 262 couldn't, he went into full takeover mode and attempted to rip Messerschmitt AG away from Willy's grasp. Now Udet was inclined to agree until Willy sent his chief designer, Voigt, over to go and talk to him about how the two programs were really very separate and there couldn't be any question of one taking the other over. Udet, being quite pliable at this point, agreed. But as Voigt was about to leave, a little bit like Columbo, he mentioned,
"Oh, there's one more thing, sir."
He'd been having a look at Lippisch's drawings for the Me163, and frankly, he was a little surprised that no one had suggested building a giant, tailless, international bomber rocket thing on the back of it. What if we could go to America with rockets? How cool would that be? Actually, he casually mentioned, look, I've done some specifications. Maybe give them to Lippisch to build. And Udet agreed. Next day, he sent orders to Alexander for a new, massive bomber, and Lippisch had a mental breakdown, having to spend 2 weeks in hospital. In September of 1941, Udet finally did the decent thing for any high-ranking Nazi, and he shot himself, much to everyone's relief. This was very, very bad for Willy Messerschmitt, because it meant that Udet's right-hand man, Erhard Milch, was promoted in his place. And Milch absolutely fucking loathed Messerschmitt. Pre-war, Milch had run Germany's totally innocent and absolutely not a front for rearming national airline Luftwaffe. Lufthansa, sorry. He ordered a few M20 transports off Willy. Willy was a good manufacturer of aircraft. The M20 looked like a fairly decent thing on paper. He bought a couple. Makes sense. Like many Messerschmitt aircraft, however, in this story, the M20 could best be described as a bit crashy. When one of the aircraft went down, the pilot, Hans Hackemark, tried to bail out, only to be dragged to a fiery death by an entangled parachute. And Willy, being Willy, didn't really care about this sort of thing. It happened all the time, and he was off to the next project, so he didn't, investigate the crash or go to the funeral or whatever. He just kind of shrugged and carried on. The problem was that Hans was Milch's best mate, so not just had Willy sold Milch a crap aircraft, he'd also killed Erhard's best pal. The ensuing lawsuit would have crushed Messerschmitt were he not bailed out in 1933 by the massive appearance of defence contracts owing to a certain Mr. A. Hitler's new government. From that day forwards, Milch made it his life's work to fuck Willy Messerschmitt. As Milch and Lippisch and Messerschmitt carried on their various feuds, work on the Me262 sort of limped along. BMW finally admitted defeat on their Brahmo engines, and Junkers stepped up, stepping into the fray with their T1 and then their A1 engines, which were both better than the BMW ones on account of being, real. By early 1942, Junkers had agreed to the production of a new engine, imaginatively titled the B1, which would be ready in August. Fortunately for us, but unfortunately for all of the Nazi asses in our story, it was about now that the Me210 program really started to fall apart. Now, I firmly believe that alongside the HE-177A, the Me210 was one of the greatest aircraft of World War II. At low speeds, it would stall without warning. If it banked, it could either enter into a flat spin or do the turn. You never knew which it was going to do. The engines would catch on fire at startup, in level flight, and sometimes on shutdown, apparently at random. It would, even with very gentle manoeuvring, sometimes simply turn itself upside down and dive into the ground. The weight distribution was so completely wrong due to its various bits of armour plating that level flight sometimes required as much as 70% starboard stick, until suddenly it didn't anymore. The wings were not really strong enough, so now and again they'd simply rip off. Moreover, when it was finally, and I feel completely unfairly, cancelled in April of 1942, the Reich was committed to buying vast numbers of them from subcontractors in Hungary, and it couldn't cancel the orders, resulting in hundreds and hundreds of completely useless aircraft being made over the next 3 years. Hence the 40 million Reichsmarks, that's roughly $900 million in today's money, that was demanded by Milch and the Luftwaffe off Messerschmitt. You might want to refresh your popcorn at this point because it's about to get even worse. Now that the 210 had gone to shit, Milch felt that it was the right moment to turn the screws. Firstly, he attempted to outsource production of the Me262 to Junkers. Then he brought in his seaplane experts, that's Blom and Voss, to build all the tooling so that they could steal all of Willy's know-how by proxy. Then, under the pretext of preventing Allied bombers damaging the program, he ordered the whole production line to be broken up and distributed across Germany. Finally, in June of 1942, he fired Messerschmitt from his own board. This actually wound up hurting Milch more than he might have expected for two reasons. Firstly, Hitler thought that Messerschmitt was a genius and vital to the war effort. And secondly, because of the capital structure of Messerschmitt AG. See, the thing is that Willy owned 38.5% of the stock, and since 1939 he'd actually been banging the lovely Baroness Lily von Melchem-Rulow, who by happy coincidence controlled the other 61.5%, meaning that you now had the main shareholders out of the board but effectively still in power, a recipe for complete disaster. Raising new capital for the firm became impossible without Willy's say-so, and each new Nazi board member that was parachuted in or new boss that was brought in to run a particular department without Willy's say-so was easily and quickly sidelined, whilst the rest of the company stagnated under this hilarious new kind of management that Milch had accidentally created. And to make matters even worse, Milch didn't stop there. He really shoved the knife in, reviving the Lipschitz saga and setting up a separate office still within Messerschmitt for Lipschitz to work with the other tailless wonder brothers, the Hortens. And this move was purely vindictive, and it slowed down the entire company even more, really wrecking the 163 program in the process. Taken together, it looked for all the world like Milch was prioritising screwing Willy over winning the war. Because he was. And this fact was not lost on Hitler or anyone around Milch. Meanwhile, in about June, but the dates are altogether unclear, the first Jumo T1 engines appeared at Augsburg, and the Me262 flew for the first time on jet power on the 18th of July 1942. And then it promptly crashed. Nonetheless, the plane could fly. Sort of. The takeoff distance was vast, about 790 metres fully loaded, and they had to do a terrifying dab of the brakes halfway down the runway to lift the tail off the ground, which if you got wrong, you would catapult yourself straight through the fence at the bottom of the runway, which happened on the first time that an RLM test pilot gave it a go. Not that any of our protagonists really cared, because they were too busy stabbing one another in the back at the time. Flying or not, there was still a vast amount to do. Over the next year and change, there would be 10 different prototypes, 8 of which were crashed. Junkers continued to work on their engines, and over the following year they got a pair of Jumo 004B1s finally ready after an exhaustive redesign and rebuild. And that then is when the proverbial shit hit the actual fan of Hitler's oratory. Now this next bit might be a tad controversial. In March of 1943, the Office of Chief Designer Voigt released a paper, ADRC/T2-2645/156, and I'm sure we all know precisely what that says, so we can just move on, right? No, for fuck's sake, people, keep up. Now, just before we go any further with this, just remember that everybody here has an agenda, and quite a lot of them are lying quite a lot of the time. So here's the thing, if you basically know anything at all about the Me262, it's that Hitler ordered it to be converted into a fighter bomber, and that delayed production for like 12 months or something. Had he not done this, then there would have been on D-Day, I don't know, the resounding whistles and whines of Me262s downing Allied aircraft, or some such nonsense. The fact is that the Me262 was always going to be a fighter bomber, and document ARC/T2-2645/156 proves it. By November 1943, Goering was a shadow of his former self. Well, he wasn't. He was massively fatter, but with day bombing and night bombing happening on the Reich on a daily basis and cock-ups on basically every front, his political influence was really over. Goering, being Goering, decided that what was really required here was less competence and more putting a bit more Reich into the Reichsmarschall. So on the 26th of November 1943 at Insterburg in East Prussia, Goering assembled a cast of Luftwaffe wacky racist designs that he got on the go, and he brought Hitler along to take a look. Here was the Fritz X guided bomb, the Me163, the TA-152, the TA-154, the HE-219, and of course, the Me262. In fact, there were two of them. But being the bombastic tosspot that he was, Goering decided that this needed to be his show, not anyone else's, so he literally stole the notes off the speakers and read them out loud. And this was a problem because he hadn't really got a fucking clue what he was talking about, and some of the aircraft were missing. Standing in front of an Me410, he proudly proclaimed it to be a DO 335. So here is an Me410, and here is a DO 335. See if you can spot the fucking difference, because Hitler sure as shit could, and he tore a strip off Goering in front of the assembled Golffasan of the Nazi High Command. By the time they got to the Me262, it was fair to say that Goering was having a bit of a day of it. Hitler looked at the jet. The jet looked at Hitler. Well, okay, I mean, of course it didn't, because it was an inanimate object, but maybe the machine spirit did. Whatever. Hitler says, "Tell me, Reichsmarschall, can this thing carry bombs?" And there's a freeze frame, and the narrator says, "And nothing would ever be the same again," or something. In reality, Goering paused, and quick as a flash, Willy Messerschmitt piped up with, "Yes, mein Führer, either 2 500-kilogram bombs or one 1,000-kilogram bomb." Now, what Willy had just done was essentially to massage Hitler's enlarged rhetorical prostate with a 262-shaped sex toy, because he came hard. Hitler apparently went all glassy-eyed and started ranting about this aircraft, that he, the genius of the German people, could clearly see that this was no fighter, it was a blitz bomber, that as the Allies assembled over in England or as they unloaded in France, this fine bomber would unleash death and destruction. It would wipe the Allied invasion off the map. Even though Goering thought it was a fighter, he, Hitler, he alone could see that this was a bomber, a blitz bomber. This was the aircraft that they'd been talking about, craving for years, and now here it was, and oh God, I'm so fucking bored. It's a Hitler rant. No one took it that seriously. The thing with Willy Messerschmitt is he had always had urges. Okay, well, no, not like that. Well, I mean, maybe, I don't know. Not the point. I mean, he had urges for making new stuff. I mean, his whole life was about designing aircraft. And if that meant paying the rent whilst lying on his back and thinking of the fatherland, well, he was kind of okay with that, provided that he could carry on designing more aircraft. Manufacturing them, though, well, that was where it all started to get a bit shaky. He wasn't great at turning concepts into actual products. He couldn't really help but to continue to design long after everything was supposed to have been locked down. As for instance, a file from the 11th of September 1943, that's just 4 weeks after the basic design for the A1 and the A2 had been nailed down. There are plans for not 1, not 2, not 3, but 10 new variants. You've got fighters, you've got rocket-boosted interceptors, you've got recon planes, you've got rocket-boosted bombers. Not one of each of these, by the way, but multiple types. And it was a recipe for disaster. This proliferation of types never stopped, and just 8 weeks before the end of the war, he was still going. There were still new ideas being examined. The last experimental variant made an appearance in March 1945, and none of this helped to focus on the problem at hand of actually trying to build, the basic aircraft that he had ready. In Willy's September 1943 files, there are 3 versions of what he called the Schnellbomber. He'd shown his ideas for a fighter bomber to Hitler months before this meeting at Insterburg. So when he said, "Yes, mein Führer, of course it can carry bombs," he was actually saying, "Yeah, boss, we talked about this." And document ADRC/T2-2645/156 clearly shows it. Willy wasn't talking total bollocks. But that's not quite the whole story. On the plans that you can see from the 11th of September, and indeed from earlier times, there are a couple of small bombs. It is not a dedicated bomber variant. And it didn't have a bomb sight of any kind or anywhere to put one. The Me262 couldn't dive bomb because it would crash into the ground at well north of 1,000 kilometers an hour. Even on shallow runs, it still wouldn't work because it risked going too fast. Bombing from, say, 20,000 feet would render the whole exercise absolutely pointless without massive further development. But flying at low altitude wasn't really an option either, as the thicker air and crappy aerodynamics of the externally stored bombs and the swept wings would combine to give the Me262 the range of an anemic sloth. In fact, the only advantage that 262 really had was going very fast, and ladening it down with all those bombs would render the whole exercise pretty bloody pointless. To carry any bombs at all, the plane would need new Jumo C1 engines, which didn't exist in November of 1943. So why did Willy do a Willy? And the answer is, he was a lying collaborating tosspot who, like Göring and almost every other sycophantic fuckwit around Hitler, couldn't help themselves from obeying the Hitler precept and telling the boss whatever the fuck he wanted to hear at whatever moment he felt he needed to hear it, because doing so meant he could carry on earning a fuck ton of money and keep redesigning aircraft. Moreover, lots of delays to the 262 meant more Bf-109s, which meant more cash for his business, which he really needed at this point. In fact, with enough delays, the on-again, off-again Me209 program might be brought back, and Willy really wanted to make the Me209. Plus, all of this would seriously piss Milch off. What he perhaps wasn't quite ready for was triggering the switch-marked psychotic rant in Hitler's tiny little brain. But Hitler ranted all of the time, and he rarely remembered precisely what he'd said unless Martin Bormann was there to remind him, so, why worry? Problem was, in this particular instance, Hitler really did remember what he'd said, and he walked away expecting to see only fighter-bomber versions being made, and Willy walked away thinking he could make the fighters, and at some vague, undefined point in the future, he would make a Blitzbomber. For sure, it wasn't that hard, but it's probably a couple of years of work, and Göring just walked away. I swear to God, only the Nazis can fuck this shit up quite like this. Over the next 6 months or so, lots of people became aware of the Me262 as a fighter. Göring and Galland and Speer and Milch and many others all tried to change Hitler's mind, but to no avail. It got so bad at one point that Hitler actually issued a Führer edict prohibiting anybody to discuss the Me262 with him. Milch committed political suicide when he shouted at Hitler mid-conference, "For God's sakes, a child can see that that's a fighter, not a bomber." The net result is that over the years, various writers, most notably David fucking Irvin, Adolf Galland, Mano Ziegler, and even Max Hastings have merrily gone around saying that had this meeting in November not happened, then they would have been flying Me262s, shooting down Allied fighters out of the sky in early 1944, and it cost the Germans maybe 12 months of development. But the thing is, this is actually total bollocks. The aircraft was a death trap in November of 1943. It was more problematic than Jeremy Clarkson in a vegan restaurant, and the project had basically been rudderless for more than 3 years. The massive shortage of critical production metals meant that the aircraft was months behind already, and none of the flight systems were properly developed. The Jumo B004B1 and B2 engines were exploding due to design compromises that were there to reduce the nickel consumption because of the aforementioned shortage of metals. The design parameters would continue to shift well into 1944, and almost nothing about the aircraft was ready for production when the assembly line started to be pulled together in February of 1944. The whole schedule for building prior to Insterburg had allowed for just 40 units to be delivered to frontline by December of 1944. The problem was in no way ready, and it could not be made ready, and although the fighter-bomber stuff was a complete distraction, the basic project was never going to see 262s whizzing around over Normandy. When the first examples did start to filter down to frontline units, the basic flaws in the program would reveal themselves in dramatic fashion. Testing and development continued for the next 6 months, boosted in March 1944 with the development of the Jagerstab, or the fighter staff under Albert Speer's right-hand man and all-round Nazi arsehole Karl Sauer. It was concluded by Karl and his team that it was impossible to see Galland's desire to have thousands of Me262s flying through the air next month. It just simply couldn't be fulfilled, or at least not really before 1946, but also that some production of Me262s was crucial. There then followed a frankly hilarious few months where Göring and Milch and Sauer and various others tried to get the elusive Willy Messerschmitt to explain why his fighter couldn't be a bomber, and whose fault all of this was, and how the hell to mount a second seat and a bomb sight in an aircraft which had never been designed to take either of those things, none of which was really ever properly resolved for the entirety of the war. Sauer, who had absolutely no experience of building aircraft but an awful lot of experience at using slave labour to advance his political career, had managed by September of 1944 to produce 111 Me262s out of a projected 150 that he'd promised that he was going to make when he took over, almost all of which suffered from massive build quality problems that we'll look at in a minute. None of this helped to actually sort out the basic fundamental design flaws that still existed in the airframe. And then to sort of kibosh all this talk of bombers, there was, of course, the AR-234 coming up on the rails, which had a significant advantage as a bomber on account of it having been built as a bomber from scratch. But then it had the disadvantage of being made by Anando, who were basically a tiny little outfit, and before the war had ended, they'd only managed to make 230 aircraft. However, Hitler used the existence of the AR-234 to start being able to walk back from his original position, and to deal with the blindingly obvious fact that that Me262 over there really was a fucking fighter. It's not a bomber, and patently so. So you've been very patient. Let's actually have a look at the plane and see what flew in late 1944 and early 1945, and if it was any good. Most people like jets. I mean, unless they've suffered some kind of serious head injury, or they're blind, or they're just sick in their souls. Jets zoom around the sky. They make loads of noise. They go really, really fast. Much faster than piston-engine planes. Just the idea of them brings me to half-mast. So, when someone turns around and goes to you, you see that F-22 there. The Germans basically had one of those in World War II. It's hardly surprising that everybody absolutely shits their pants and talks about how amazing and technically advanced the Germans were, and completely forgets that the Me262 is utterly, irredeemably crap as an aircraft, and it always has been crap, and it was crap at the time. So let's talk about the good points, because there are a couple of them. It was seriously fast. The Me262A1, the dedicated fighter version, was capable, when it was clean-laden, of a shade over 540 miles an hour at 16,000 feet in level flight. And that, for World War II, that is fucking fast. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the Hawker Tempest was probably the fastest Allied piston-engine aircraft of the war, but in level flight it was nearly 100 miles an hour slower at the same altitude. The DO-335 push-me-pulley thing was supposed to be able to get to about 475 miles an hour, but I will be absolutely fucked if I believe a single word of the propaganda that those guys pushed out. One of you nerds will know far more about that monstrosity than I do. Whatever. To use a Bristolian turn of phrase normally associated with the souped-up Vauxhall Nova of the late 1990s, the Me262 was girt forest. Most of the time, and I stress most of the time, pilots reported that it was fairly easy to fly, comparable to an FW-190 or an ME-109, which is probably good. It was able to climb incredibly fast, especially from medium to high altitude, which was excellent in an interceptor. It had great visibility from the bubble cabin, perhaps not as good as, say, a Mustang, but it was pretty good. At the time, an awful lot of piston-engine aircraft were reaching the edge of what's known as compression. This is where you start to get to the point where wind over the surfaces becomes transonic. It means that things get locked up. It's incredibly hard to, say, move your flaps, and it causes a lot of crashes. And the Me262, because of its swept wings, was able to control this better than other contemporary aircraft, which is good. The Jumo engines could run off less refined fuel, basically a kind of a diesel, a sort of kerosene kind of compound, which was good because Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces said, "Nice oil you've got there. Be a shame if someone bombed all your synthetic oil facilities." But, oh God, the buts. In June of 1945, Fritz Wendel, the first man to fly an Me262 with jets installed, wrote an after-action report for the Americans at Curtis Field. A batch of 9 were about to be sent over to the United States on the decks of HMS Reaper as part of something called Operation Lusty. We'll pick that up another day. He called out many, many faults for the Me262 at the end of the war. In short, it was still basically a prototype aircraft which really shouldn't have gone anywhere near the front lines. I mean, first of all, let's have a look at those Jumo engines. They were a very decent theoretical design for a first-generation jet engine. But the Reich was being choked harder than Jeffrey Epstein in a jail cell. The various compromises and shortages in the design meant that the engines themselves had a lifespan of a mayfly. On paper, they could theoretically go about 50 hours before needing to be stripped down and serviced, but a bit like me, they actually needed to have it much more often. Roughly every 20 hours of normal flying at a minimum. When the plane went into combat, it was between 4 and 8 hours before each of those engines would need to be rebuilt, and that assumed that the pilot was lucky. Throw the throttle forward at the wrong moment or cut back too fast at the wrong second, and the engine would flood and it would promptly catch fire. On the ground, this was a problem. In the air, it was fatal. As Boeing is currently learning the hard way, build quality on jet planes is kind of important. Testing them is key. Engineers at Messerschmitt and the RLM reckoned that the Me262 would need about 3,000 hours of testing before it went into production, and it actually got less than 10% of that time. A combination of rushed effort, constant bombing, dispersed factories, bad machine tooling, cost cutting meant build quality was already completely shitty. But from February 1944, 70% of the workforce on the Me262 were either forced foreign workers or concentration camp victims. As the bombing by the RAF and the US AAF intensified pressure on Germany's economy and the aircraft industry in particular, the Nazis attempted to disperse their manufacturing into multiple underground locations. And who says that area bombing doesn't work? In reality, this only partially happened, and manufacturing continued at various sites throughout Germany, but there was a plan to have a single hardened plant which was supposed to become the final assembly for the majority of Me262s from January 1945. 15,000 slaves were corralled into a former Volksberg sand mine under a mountain to begin production of the Me262. The site, codenamed Salmon, was the scene of almost unimaginable horror. Starvation was used as punishment, hangings occurred on a daily basis, torture with barbed wire and electricity were routine, and in a few short months of operation, more than 1,000 prisoners died there. Effective, it was not. Other sites, less dramatic in nature but only fractionally less barbaric in action, were established using forced labour and slave labour elsewhere. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht's massive losses on both the Western and the Eastern Front created panicked waves of conscription from the various competing bodies of the Reich. Skilled labour that might otherwise have been used far more productively in factories was sent direct to die on the front pointlessly. Unsurprisingly, all of this meant that the Me262 did not exactly have the finest build quality in the world. Throttle stops that went to different distances, seals that broke, canopies that blew off at random mid-flight, glues that came unstuck, dials that just failed or fell out of the panels that they were supposed to be in power that varied from one engine to the other, apparently at random, control surfaces that fell off, footholds that shattered, electrics that failed, fuel systems that caught fire, undercarriage arms that collapsed or went clean through the wings on landing, nose wheels that threw dirt into the engines causing explosions, and so on, and so on, and so on. Such was the price of being a bunch of Nazi fuckers. My absolute favourite of all of the failures that they managed to do was when they decided to put some rocket assistance onto the 262's engines, and they sort of ran a cable from the cockpit past the pilot's seat out to the wings. And this is all fine, I guess. It was done in a bit of a hurry, though. So if the pilot decided to adjust their seat up, it pulled the cable. And sometimes this was fine, but at least twice Me262 rockets suddenly fired and propelled the unsuspecting pilot towards the horizon with the engines off, killing one and burning another one half to death. Even when built properly, the Me262's range wasn't good. Initially, it was only about 120 miles, massively limiting their potential use, and even by war's end, and even when fitted with drop tanks, they could only fly for about 2 hours or so. Assuming, that is, of course, that the engine survived that long, because that was not a given. The undercarriage, as I mentioned a minute ago, was a constant source of problems, having had to be redesigned multiple times due to collapses and the inability to take the weight of the aircraft, a problem not helped by the extra weight of the A2 bomber version. The Mk108 and 105 cannon constantly had issues, jamming, refusing to eject cartridges, or misfiring without warning, and then they were on mountings that were never really fully sorted out, meaning they were often highly inaccurate. The amount of ammo, 360 rounds for the 108s for example, was tiny, and muzzle velocities weren't exactly high, and that meant hitting targets was pretty tricky unless you were perfectly lined up, and it required pilots to get far closer than you might have expected before they actually opened fire. Balance was a continual problem because of the fuel tank distribution, and as the tanks drained, that became progressively worse, so it required constant trimming to maintain level flight. In the A2 version, when the bombs were added, the weight shifted far, far to the aft, pushing the tail down and making the plane incredibly hard to get off the ground. To help kind of fix this, they fitted an auxiliary fuel tank, but the problem with this is they did it in a bit of a rush, so there was no fuel gauge in the cockpit. The pilot had to judge how much weight was left in it manually and guess how far it had left, and if he forgot to drain the tank prior to dropping the bombs, the plane would go nose up suddenly and the wings would be ripped off. In order to try and avoid this sort of everyday common household accident, they developed something called the Schleppgerät, This was a small V1 wing that was attached to either a 500kg or a 2,000kg bomb, or indeed occasionally a fuel tank, and attempted to tow that behind the aircraft. This went incredibly badly. In October 1944, one unfortunate test pilot had to land with a live 2,000kg bomb still attached to the aircraft after an electrical failure. Aside from the balance problems and the range issues, all the fuel tanks suffered from feed problems with pumps that didn't work or went too fast, lines that got blocked or would feed erratically into engines and suddenly cause them to catch fire or stop without warning. The Me262 was heavy, including fuel, as about 14,500 pounds. That's about 15% more than the P-47D, or about 40% heavier than a P-51D. A combination of weight and swept wings and engine issues meant that it had serious issues taking off and landing, making it highly vulnerable around its airfields when it was operating, and a goodly number were shot down in taking off or landing. Climbing below 5,000 feet used a massive amount of fuel, limiting the range even further than usual, so although it had clear advantages over Allied fighters near the deck, it couldn't stay there very long. Up high, it had very serious problems. Touching the throttle over 20,000 feet would almost always cause the engines to stop, and operational ceilings were about 30,000 feet, theoretically about 5,000 feet lower than the top of a B-17 service ceiling. To fix this, some genius came up with the idea of adding a Walther rocket to the back of the aircraft, ready to be fired Wile E. Coyote style if the engines packed in. To my knowledge, this was never actually tried, but it's kind of a shame that it wasn't. Most of the time it flew fine and was pretty forgiving until suddenly it wasn't anymore. The combination of a teeny tiny tailplane, which was sort of stuck on as an afterthought, and a weird power delivery from its engines could cause sudden instability, especially above 10,000 feet, without really any warning at all. Using the throttle pushed the nose around in unpredictable ways that were novel to those that hadn't flown a jet before, and if it was, called on to turn, it just couldn't do it, really. Every single piston-engined fighter could turn better than it could, meaning if it got into a dogfight, unless it dived away or climbed, it was totally fucked, and Spitfires and Tempests, P-51s, P-47s, P-38s and Mosquitoes all got kills on Me262s in turning fights. It was heavily weather limited. If there was heavy moisture in the air, it tended to flame out, and at high altitude, the engines could sometimes shut down in cloud. Going up high presented quite significant problems with the de-icing processes. They essentially reduced to bodging something, requiring pilots to hand pump fuel directly onto the canopy, and then they told crews to wear US flying jackets to protect against the cold. Snaking, where an aircraft can slip sideways the whole time, is often a problem on two-engine jets. The Gloucester Meteor F1, for example, had the same kinds of issues, but unlike on the Meteor, it was never eliminated from the 262, meaning it was a very poor gun platform. In short, it was basically a bit shite at most things other than going very fast. And it might have been developed a bit further, but a lot of what Willy and Voigt had chosen to do meant that they'd sort of gone down some technological dead ends. And you can kind of see that with the lack of 262 features turning up on later aircraft like, say, the Lightning or the Starfighter or the Sabre and so on. It swept wings, and that's kind of it. The most used headline for the Me262 is "The fighter that almost won the war," or some other crap like, "The plane that nearly turned the tide of World War II." And both are absolute horseshit. The proof of how bobbins the Me262 was is in the statistics. It's credited with something like 540 kills through its operational history from summer 1944 to its demise in 1945, and about 450 airframes actually wound up at the front being used operationally. It's worth noting here that Speer claimed that he'd come up with about 1,500, but that's just Speer being Speer and talking shite, or at least if he did make that many, they disappeared before getting anywhere near the front. So very crudely, each airframe accounted for about 1.2 enemies, which, if this is really the aeronautical equivalent of the Umbermenschen, is pretty shit. It's especially shit when you start to consider that on any given day in late 1944 and spring 1945, the 8th Air Force alone was sticking up 1,200 bombers in a raid, and probably about the same again in fighters. 540 kills is completely rubbish, even if it's true, and I remind you that everyone in this story is lying about the numbers here. You'll regularly come across somebody saying something like, "Well, if they'd made thousands of them, they could have won." Well, first off, we've just shown that this damn thing was probably 2 years from being ready as it was, so they were never going to be able to make thousands of them, even if Göring et al. Hadn't played silly buggers with the development cycle and the manufacturing processes. But even if the Germans had got it all right, which was never going to happen, it wouldn't have saved the Reich or come close. Throughout the operational life of the Me262, squadrons were able to keep, at best, just 15% of their aircraft flying at any one moment in time, and that's just not good enough. Luftwaffe squadrons running piston engine planes, even at this point in the war were still in the mid-60s. If you only have slightly better than one machine in 10 that's actually airworthy, then that aircraft is as crap as a Porsche gearbox in a big metal clanky box, and essentially useless as a weapon of war. The German pilots in 1944, moreover, weren't really capable of taking on their opposite numbers, even in much superior equipment. The Me262 wouldn't have helped them. New German pilots going into combat had about 10 hours of flying time on jets and probably another 50 to 60 hours on piston engine aircraft. Allied fighter pilots going into combat had hundreds of hours of preparation and then probably 50 to 100 hours in the combat zone as familiarization flights. Even had they not outnumbered the Germans by 20 or 30 to 1, Allied pilots were just better flyers, and if there had been a real need, then the Gloucester Meteor could easily have been rushed into combat. The other great claim is that an Me262 shot down a Mozzie on the 20th of August 1944, which is usually put forward as the first kill, and it might have been. The only problem here is that there's not actually a record of a Mozzie being lost that day. In fact, of the 25 Mozzies that 262 pilots would claim during the course of the war, there are only 3 losses which match RAF records, a fact which is perhaps explained by the cash bonuses that Luftwaffe flyers were offered for shooting down Mosquito aircraft. I will, because I am British and smug, just point out that the first Meteors were operational in July, and they made their first kill on the 3rd of August 1944, on a V-1 flying bomb. So no, the Me262 was not the first operational jet, nor the first jet fighter, nor did it get the first kill. We will do a thing on the Meteor one day, but for now let's just recognise that the Me262 was neither the best nor the first really at anything other than going fast in a straight line. In fighter-bomber format, 25 aircraft were made operational from August of 1944 to October of 1944, of which more than half were shot down or crashed without achieving basically anything. Another 40 operated for the rest of the war out of German air bases, and so far as we can tell, they never actually hit a single target, to the extent that Luftwaffe HQ stopped giving them targets after a while, and it's not like they were short of things to shoot at. As fighters, most likely the first kills were as part of experimental squadrons developed in about September, but the first proper JG squadron, known as Commando Novotny, commanded by, and I know this is going to come as a bit of a shock, a chap called Novotny, went online in November of 1944. In 4 weeks of flying, they lost 26 out of the 30 aircraft that they were given before being disbanded, during which time they got 22 kills and lost 7 pilots. Those are fucking sucky numbers, and they are pretty typical, at least initially. Over time, groups like 3JG7 got some more kills with R4M air-to-air rockets under the wings, which significantly boosted their kill-to-loss ratio. But for supposedly all-conquering jets years ahead of its piston-engine opponents, it was rubbish, and after years of effort and so many deaths, these damn things didn't make a bloody difference. And the whole thing was really a giant waste of effort and energy that achieved nothing for the Reich. Come in, lads, come in. Take off your flying overalls, take a DSO from the box, have a nice cup of tea and a chat. You've made it to the Survivors Club, and Jenkins and I are very glad that you're here. In all of this, I can see how US flyers who came across Me262s might have been very shocked indeed, and I can see how the pilots of the Luftwaffe might have felt that the happy times would come again if only they could get the 262 up into the skies over Germany. But the reality was it was a pretty mediocre fighter. It was outclassed by the Meteor in almost every respect. It was designed badly, built even worse, and handled badly, and fighting for an evil cause in a war that it couldn't hope to win, so there, frankly, that's my conclusion on the Me262. I imagine that there might have been 1 or 2 people during the course of this who disagreed, and if they're still here, well then, fair play to them. I have drawn extensively from Dan Sharp's book Messerschmitt 262 Development and Politics, Fritz Wengel's after-war fightings, particularly his notes to Curtis Field, Mano Ziegler's Hitler's Jet Airplane, Adolf Galland's books The View from the Cockpit and The First and the Last, and Martin Kitchen's Speer. And all of these sources are problematic to some extent. Ziegler, for example, is an unreconstructed Nazi, and he writes like one. Galland lies constantly. Speer has a quote for all occasions. Wendel shot himself in 1959, and so on and so on and so on. However, I think as best as one can, I've drawn together the sources that there are into something broadly cohesive, and my conclusion stands. The Me262 was a bit of shit Nazi kit. If you enjoyed this and you'd like me to do more, then please feel free to like and subscribe, and maybe even consider joining my Patreon. We have a super secret Discord, and you can help me fund my book habit. And a massive thanks to those of you who've already signed up. I really couldn't do this stuff without your help. If you'd like to send me an email, absolutely feel free to. It's lordhardthrasher@gmail.com. Couldn't be simpler. Well, we will leave things there this time, and thank you once again, and I hope to see you all very, very soon.